Welcome back to the Tipsy Theology Podcast. And if it's your first time, well, then just plain old welcome. Don't welcome back, just welcome too. This today is episode number 50. And in the United States currency, the $50 bill features the portrait of Ulysses S. Grant, who is the 18th president of the United States. And that is significant for us today because this is like the 18th time we've tried to record this podcast. And between technical issues and scheduling conflicts, we're finally here. Either way, I'm very excited to talk to you and have David Lawrence on the podcast. And he's the author of the book Debunking Determinism, Robert Sapolsky, Sam Harris, and the Crusade Against Free Will. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Happy 50th anniversary.
Thank you. I'm happy you're here for this. It's kind of fortuitous, maybe it was predetermined all along.
Well, we'll talk about that.
I know, right? Well, hey, thanks for being here. I'm excited, and I hope you're doing well today, and you're ready for this big conversation.
I am ready. I'm not doing as well as you because you're sipping a strawberry margarita, or was I not supposed to give that away?
Ooh, surprise, surprise. Yeah, I thought we were doing it together, and then you decided to be responsible.
Well, I decided to go in the opposite direction with the caffeine charge.
Which is good. I feel like that's a different kind of buzz, but all along the same. Maybe.
Here's
Maybe.
to here's to both. Here's to both.
Cheers to
Strawberry
that.
margaritas and coffee. Hey, maybe we should combine the two. That's probably not been done too.
Oh, it's kind of like
Caffeine, strawberry margaritas. You got the sugar, you got the caffeine, you got the strawberries. What else could anyone want?
you're just gonna feel normal because your body's like, what is happening right now?
What the hell is happening?
You're right. Well, yeah. So I'm excited. So strawberry margaritas, that's your go-to drink, isn't it?
It was a long time ago
Okay.
before I
Okay.
became more and more resistant to sugar. Um,
Oh yeah.
I had this favorite mix or blend or bottle, and it was like 90% sugar. Strawberry was the last thing on it. Sure, syrup flavors and sugar and strawberry syrup and strawberry jam and
Oh,
a way past the sugar.
and a dash of strawberry.
Allegedly with natural and
Legend.
artificial flavor.
They're like, we looked at a strawberry when we made it.
I don't think they did.
You're like, there's no way.
No. Made in a laboratory strawberries. It was good, by the way. Don't get me wrong. That was a great drink.
It sounds really good. I feel like you can't go wrong with a margarita, and especially a strawberry margarita.
I wholeheartedly endorse that statement. You can't go wrong.
Were you more of like a frozen margarita guy, or did you drink it on ice?
No, no, no. You got to have crushed ice.
Okay,
Not
right on.
but with crushed ice mixed in.
Yeah. Okay, that
And
sounds
there's no
good.
other way. In fact, your can over there is sacrilege. Where's your ice?
Actually, I did pour it into this mason glass. It's not crushed ice, unfortunately, because I just cube them. But I was like, it's close. I'm getting there. But it is a little bit sad.
Get a blender. Okay. Splurge, splurge, sell the guitar in the background, sell the keyboards, get a blender, and make a strawberry margarita the way it's supposed to be made.
You're right. You're right. I'm gonna do it.
All right.
Well, so I'm curious, what brought you to the strawberry margarita?
Oh, I guess I just always loved strawberries.
Okay.
Never liked hard alcohol like whiskey and so forth, and or
Mm,
scotch. And so, or rum or gin, never liked that stuff.
okay. Yeah.
So sweet, fruity, my favorite fruit. What more could a person want?
Hey, I love the reasoning.
But this is not a harder seasoned drinker here. I mean, it's like dessert. It's like
Okay,
alcoholic.
yeah. That's true. It is really refreshing too. It's a refreshing
So
drink. So
send me to the refrigerator in a minute.
like I gotta find something in here. I am curious, as well, if you don't mind me asking. I know this
Huh.
is a really big in some Christian circles as well, this question, um, which is, what are your views on alcohol?
My views are simple. It begins and ends with strawberry margaritas. I mean, that's it. That's
No
really,
controversy.
I don't have any moral stance or any strong, psychological beliefs about the issue.
Hmm.
If I didn't have sugar issues, I would probably consume more.
Okay, right on.
Yeah.
I can support that.
Nothing wrong with relaxing in this world, as far as I'm concerned. It's
There's
hard
so much
enough.
stuff that's going to stress us out. We need
Yeah.
all we can get.
Yeah. I think oddly enough, Sapolsky has a book or a tape on the effects of stress on the brain, and it's very interesting. I mean,
Hmm.
stress is more damage than we realize.
Really?
And yet here we are in the midst of it constantly in modern life. Yeah.
Wow.
Commend that to everybody rather than his book on free will.
The one on stress.
Excellent.
I've been trying to find ways to get less stressed in my life and kind of restructure my
Mhm.
days to avoid that as much as I can.
It's a challenge in modern society. It is a challenge.
That's true. It's true. Well, okay, so determinism, free will. What is it?
I thought you were going to tell me. Aren't I
Uh,
interviewing you, or do I have it backwards here?
are you interviewing me? Is that the
I thought so, but I'm happy to be flexible.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm
free will,
underprepared to answer these questions.
free will is pretty much, well, I'd love to have your input on them.
Hmm.
Um, Free will is pretty much as common sense suggests. It's the ability to deliberate, to
Hmm.
form intentions, to make decisions, to take actions, and to influence reality, which
Hmm.
means the world has to be influenceable, has to be capable of being influenced. It can't be determined.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's other definitions of free will, but what I'm using it for is the commonsensical, ordinary, what the word means definition,
Hmm.
which is sometimes referred to as libertarian free will.
Hmm.
No relationship to the political movement or anything like that. It's called libertarian free will because we are truly at liberty.
Hmm.
And it's the kind of free will that determinists really take aim for. That's absurd. It's unscientific. It's ridiculous. It would have to be a miracle and all that kind of stuff that we can
Hmm.
talk about. Determinism is just the opposite. I mean, everything that happens is predestined based on prior conditions of the universe and
Hmm.
physical events that follow the laws of physics. And everything that
Hmm.
we're thinking now has been predetermined. And every action we take, my arms moving, you listening intently, all of that stuff has been determined really at the outset of the universe in a
Hmm.
causal chain going back to the Big Bang. Nothing that happens wasn't predestined. Now, a footnote to that is that determinists typically admit to some randomness, true randomness, not having to do with our ignorance of what the
Hmm.
underlying conditions are. So, with a small exception for randomness, everything is determined. Everything happens the way it must based on prior conditions of the universe.
Huh. So where do they get this from? They're
Well,
asking.
the scientific outlook for one,
Hmm.
um, the fact that we're raised to learn pattern recognition is just a biological survival instinct.
Hmm.
It has psychological value. Instead of this crazy, stressful universe that you were talking about, everything is ordered and in its place and unfolds like it's supposed to. So there's some calming, de-stressive value
Hmm.
to think that everything happens as it must. I mean, and then there's the granddaddy of them all, I think, that's behind everything on a more fundamental level. It's the age-old battle between science and religion, between soul
Hmm.
and spirituality and materiality and physicalism.
Yeah.
And that's at play in free will, determinist beta. Are we physical? Are we mental? Are we
Hmm.
spirit? Are we matter? Can we be reduced to the play of elementary particles? Or do we have a
Hmm.
contribution to make that actually influences the world and expresses who we are? So that battle is sort of beneath the surface of all of these other kinds of things.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I'm fascinated by that too. And as I've read through your book, it makes me laugh because I don't know how familiar you are with like Christian theology and different debates within it, but there's a big one. The two terms are Calvinism and Arminianism. And the Calvinism argument, and I'm sorry for everybody who believes in either, I'm going to summarize them down to their most basic form. And the Calvinism argument says that, God predetermines things. We have the ability to make decisions, but ultimately it all happens according to what he has determined. And then there's the Arminian side of it, which is we have the ability to make any choice and affect anything any way we want. So it makes me laugh reading this on a scientific level. It's like almost the same or similar kind of arguments coming through, but to two different ends or attributed to two different players. So yeah, I find that fascinating looking at the scientific side of it and how just even within the Christian circle, it's like, yeah, both of these arguments are confusing. And there really isn't a sure like, oh, this is definitely the right answer. And I feel like we're kind of seeing that. Is that fair to say in determinism versus free will inside the scientific examples and tests that have been done? It doesn't really seem like there is like a consensus that can be made. Is that fair?
Well, there's no consensus, and to the extent there is one, it's wrong and misreads the scientific tests. If we're talking about the neuroscience studies, and we can talk
Yes.
about that. But to go back to your theology issues, how can, because this foreshadows some issues with a sort of an in-between position called compatibilism. It sort of
Mm,
says free will defined in a certain non-robust way is compatible with a causal universe. So to go back to the first one, which sort of mirrors some of the conflicts involved in that position, how can you say it's not inconsistent to say God determines everything, but we have free will within limits? I
mm.
mean, wouldn't he be determining the outcome of every choice we make? And if he is, how do we have free will? At least in the robust sense, the libertarian sense of free will, the real sense in what we take it to mean in ordinary life.
Yeah, it seems like they're both exclusive from each other.
Would seem so.
Yeah. That's what compatibilism argues on the scientific side of free will, that this kind of this
Yeah,
both idea.
it's not very scientific, although that depends on where you come out.
That's
It,
it.
Sam Harris gets this one right. They play around with the definition of free will and they water it down so that it doesn't mean anything like what it normally means.
Mm,
Compatible defines free will as well. You have a desire for the strawberry margarita, and nothing's stopping you from reaching for it, and you reach for it. So there's free will. And what's ridiculous
mm,
about it is that it doesn't matter to a compatibilist whether what's driving that, causing the desire, causing your arm to reach for it. It doesn't matter that that's programmed or caused or predestined by
mm,
subatomic particles or the state of the universe. That doesn't matter. It's free will as long as you have the desire, you're able to effectuate it, and you effectuate it without interference.
mm.
But that's not answering the question. What is the cause of that
Yeah.
desire? What is the cause of your hand reaching out? Is it based on free will or is it based on some mechanical causal events in the universe?
Mm.
And this is where I agree with Harris and Sapolsky. They get this right. They say compatibilism is nonsense. It's not using free will in the normal sense. If you're compelled to reach and you're compelled to want the lemonade and you're compelled to get it because that was predestined at the Big Bang, there's no real
Mm.
sense in which you can say you're free unless you want to fool around with definitions of free will that don't mean what we think it means by an ordinary usage and what it's supposed to mean. So I think it does a substitute, in the definition of free will and avoids the question, which is what is causing the desire? What is causing us to reach out? That's the question.
Mm.
Compatibilists duck the question by defining free will in a very watered down, tepid way.
So they're kind of like a determinist with extra steps.
Well, with extra steps, Well, I don't, that's really the question. Is there anything extra? Because if you're compelled to want the strawberry margarita and the universe was predestined so that you could reach for it and get it, there
Mm,
is no extra step. It's all mechanical.
yeah.
This is the problem with compatibilism at its root. And again, Harris and Sapolsky get this. It's one or the other. You know,
Mm,
either everything that's going on is mechanical, is the product of predetermined events or random events mixed in. Either it's a mechanical universe with a footnote
mm,
to randomness, or there's some mysterious ability to influence reality that's part of the natural order, which we don't understand yet,
mm.
pursuant to science, which we don't understand yet. But it's either mechanical or it isn't. You're either being compelled to reach for the strawberry margarita or you're not. And if you're not, it
Yeah.
could be randomness. Well, you're not responsible for that, clearly. Or
Hmm.
it could be exercise of free will, which science doesn't truly understand. Of course, science doesn't truly understand a lot of things, and that's
True.
it's a conversation that we can have. Since the fundamental laws of physics are rather incomplete and uncertain,
Hmm.
it's no higher of a standard that we should have for free will. But that's a question
Hmm.
that we can get into.
Yeah, please.
So just to sum up, compatibilism avoids the hard question. You
Hmm.
know, do we live in a mechanistic universe or don't we? And by mechanistic, when I use determinism, mechanistic, and so forth, let's just assume it includes some probability, some randomness, some chance, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
As I think most determinists are prepared to accept that that's part of the spooling out of the universe as well.
Hmm.
So, are we in a mechanical universe where our desires are pre-programmed and we have to reach for the lemonade? We cannot do otherwise? Or is there free will? There's no in between. Compatibilists occupy that in between place.
Hmm.
But they do so, as Harris says, by, quote, changing the subject. That's how he puts it. They substitute for free will another definition that has nothing to do with freedom because it's compelled action or it can be compelled actions. You might say that
It's fascinating.
compatibilism just isn't compatible with reason or logic.
They threw that out the window with their definition.
And again, Harris and Sapolsky get it right.
Hmm. Just by calling them out and saying like this, we disagree, but this is clearly ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, Harris disposes of it and says it's a bait and switch
Hmm.
uh, in a couple paragraphs. Sapolsky spends a lot of time on it. He
Wow.
gives it more honor and due regard than it deserves and attacks it from every which way,
Wow.
which it should be, and about which he's right.
Hmm. Well, so I guess in that case, it comes down to it doesn't seem like there's much of a middle ground, which is sounds like what compatibilism was trying to do, failed obviously, but it's like
Mhm.
okay, is the world mechanicalistic or mechanistic, or is it something else?
Well, there's a lot of evidence, and it depends who's looking at it. But in
Hmm.
terms of the middle ground, let's go back to that for a second, because I think it's a
Sure.
very interesting question. The laws of physics are incomplete. We
Hmm.
could rattle off a list of fundamental things that we don't know that are at the root of science.
Hmm.
Now, there could be a physics, one could imagine, one could speculate, one could envision that physics in the future, imagine 200 years. I mean, look at what's happened in 100 years. Quantum physics
Yeah.
arose, relativity
Yeah.
arose. It's barely over 100 years that those things came about.
Wow.
You could imagine that some point in the future, 200 years, 300 years, 500 years, imagine what physics would be like 1,000 years from now.
We're gonna look like a joke.
Pardon me?
I said we're gonna look like a joke compared to
And,
500 years.
and will they still be drinking strawberry margaritas? That's the question. Forget determinism.
That actually is a scientific fact that they will be.
Oh, okay, good. Good. Well, I'm glad you have the crystal strawberry ball.
Yeah, of
So,
course.
but you could imagine a principle, a scientific principle
Hmm.
that's validated in which the two are part of a different aspects of one thing. That's a notion that's been talked about and considered, but it's not what compatibilism is doing. That's watering
Hmm.
down free will till it's mechanical and still calling it free will.
Hmm.
You know, I say somewhere that it's selling a Toyota but calling it a Ferrari. You know, putting a little Ferrari sticker on it. So you could imagine in the future that there is a physics principle in which the two work hand in hand in some way that we don't understand.
Mm,
It would require a different kind of relationship between events.
mm,
It could be something other than causal or random or probabilistic or chaotic or
mm.
the product of free will. It would have to be some other kind of connection. And there's some hint that there are some odd connections in quantum physics where
Okay.
scientists don't understand certain connections between a number of connections under a number of circumstances between events are simply inexplicable
Mm,
under quantum science. So one could imagine that there's a meeting of the minds and the bodies in the future,
mm.
different principles under a different science after a different revolution in scientific principles. But that's not what
Yeah.
compatibilism is doing. Compatibilism is doing the bait and switch that Harris calls them on.
So the way that we're viewing it now, there's definitely the possibility that we're looking at this completely wrong, or there's a piece that we're missing that'll change slightly how we're viewing it. So do you think that um there is something inherently in these arguments back and forth that can hinder that ability to find like what is probably true, the right relationship, or are these arguments beneficial for us to find those things?
Well, it depends on which argument.
Hmm.
The most potent argument against determinism is that it makes no sense. It's a it's illogical. It violates the rules of logic,
Hmm.
and it does. And I spend a
Bold
good
claim.
time. Pardon me?
That bold claims.
It's a bold claim, and it's rarely mentioned in the context of determinism. It is mentioned a lot in the critique of postmodernism.
Hmm.
And here's why it makes no sense. Start with postmodernism, if you like. There are certain claims that just can't be made because they contradict themselves. So
Hmm.
it's been pointed out by the critics that, well, what is the main point of postmodernism? Truth doesn't exist. Truth is a power play. It's a means of getting control over others. It's a manipulation. So if that's the case, then that statement, truth is being used as a power play,
Hmm.
as a manipulation. And so the critique is, hold on a second, you're saying that that truth doesn't exist. It's just a power play, but you're claiming, you're proposing a truth
Hmm.
that doesn't exist. Truth is a power play. And you're claiming it's something other than a power play. This is a contradiction. You can't say it's true that there is no truth without contradicting yourself.
I always lie. That's that argument.
Exactly, exactly. It's the famed old liar's paradox in
Yeah.
a slightly different form. So
Hmm.
it applies to determinism. I mean, look, the fundamental determinist claim is our thoughts and actions are determined.
Hmm.
Everything I'm thinking now is determined. And that means everything that I believe true
Hmm.
is determined. It's not within my control. I believe true,
Hmm.
whatever I'm being caused to believe true. That's determinism. That's what it says. Okay,
Yeah.
so if
Yeah.
okay, hold on a second. How do you know determinism is true? You've just said that our thoughts are determined. Well, that thought is determined. You just
Hmm.
said our thoughts are beyond our control. Well, then that means that that thought that you said is beyond your control. It means all determinist claims are beyond
Yeah.
our. You believe in determinism if you're caused to. And if you're predestined to
Yeah.
believe free will, you believe in free will.
Hmm.
So determinism is a contradiction. It's incoherent because it's defeating itself. It's taking away truth from the universe. It takes away the credibility of all truth claims to claim that the reason we believe something is because we're compelled to by physical events, by causal force.
Hmm.
Nothing is true in that case, including the statement, quote, determinism is true, our thoughts are determined, our actions are compelled,
Hmm.
our beliefs are not within our control. You can't say any of these things if they're not based on truth, if they're not based on reality. And
Yeah.
what is truth under
Huh.
determinist doctrine? It's what you're made to believe true. What is reasonable under determinist doctrine? It's what you're made to believe is reasonable,
Hmm.
etc. So determinism
Wow.
cuts the legs under itself. It gets trapped by its own net. There's no truth to anything if truth is reducible to causally compelled beliefs. Let me give you a couple of
Yeah.
examples
Yeah,
that,
please.
I gave in my book. First, I start out with sort of introducing some of the basic conventional wisdom. We talked about one, there is no truth.
Mm.
Well, really? So you're saying it's true that there is no truth? That contradicts itself. Another one is nobody knows anything. Really?
Mm.
Nobody knows anything. Well, you seem to know that. Wait a second. You seem to know someone yourself. You're claiming you know something while you're also claiming that nobody knows anything. So the structure of this logical contradiction is sometimes called a performative contradiction.
Mm.
So we're interested in the technicalities of these things. Sometimes it's called a self-defeating claim
Mm.
or self-invalidating claim. But the logic is the same. You can't say that nobody knows anything if you're making a claim that you know something.
Right.
And there's all kinds of things that violate this principle. I mentioned a couple of them. Oh, here's one: deconstructionism.
Mm.
Everything's an interpretation. Okay, well, I guess that's your interpretation. It's just an interpretation. There's no truth to it. And in fact, you are causally compelled to believe in that interpretation if you're a determinist.
I haven't thought about that one before. That's a good one.
Oh, there's a bunch of fun ones. Here's a couple from Harrison Sapolsky's playbook. Our thoughts are not of our making. This is Sam Harris's quote.
Mm.
Okay, so that means that thought wasn't of Harris's own making.
Right.
Belief that it's true wasn't of his own making. It's self-contradictory. It's nonsense. It has no meaning to
Yeah.
say our thoughts are not of our making because you're saying that that thought is not of our making. We don't control what we believe. We don't control what we think. And both free will and determined are rife with these self-contradictory statements.
Mm.
Here's another one from Harris, page 5, so I'm told. You are not in control of your mind.
Uh-oh.
Oh, so Harris, I guess you aren't in control of the mind that's saying you're not in control of your mind. Wow, okay. That's how do you pull that one off? You're not in control of your mind. I'm not in
Mm.
control of my mind. And yet you're making a truth claim that we are not in control of our minds. Well,
Mm.
what's the basis for
Mm.
that claim? You don't control it. You're causally compelled to believe it. Contradiction.
Yeah.
There's no rational basis on which you believe in truth or you can justify a belief if all of our thoughts come from physical forces
Mm.
predestined to the Big Bang or otherwise.
Yeah.
It's just nonsense. Let's play with a couple of others if you're game for it.
Absolutely.
Okay, here's one. I think this is Harris. Yeah, another Harris one. Unconscious neural events determine our thoughts and actions. Unconscious neural events determine them. Okay, well, what does that mean? It means that that thought and action, in speaking it, that was determined by unconscious neural events.
Mm.
Your thought that our thoughts are determined by conscious neural events was determined by your unconscious neural events. How does that one work? So is it true? Well, it depends on what your unconscious neural events tell you to believe. Self-defeating claim.
Yeah, it's fascinating with this too because it makes me think two different questions, but the big one right now is in a lot of ways it removes from a moral standpoint our responsibility or culpability for anything that we do when it's like, oh, well then on one hand, if someone commits a crime, well, are they actually responsible for that for doing that? And in the other way, if someone does something good, let's say they got a Nobel Peace Prize, like, well, did they actually get that? Or did whatever caused them to do it put them in position to receive that?
Right. This is the problem of morality and ethics as it relates to determinism. Harris and Sapolsky part ways on this one.
Mm.
Harris says, sure, there's morality, and even it's scientifically justified. And
Mm.
he has a book that talks about why, called The Moral Landscape. Sapolsky says, no, 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 no. You can't have it both ways. If we're
Mm.
determined, we're not in control. You can't praise us for things that we do that are wonderful because we were caused to do it. It was predestined that we do it.
At least he's consistent.
Well, he isn't. He is consistent in terms of his disavowal of morality. Unfortunately, he then goes on to offer all kinds of prescriptions that violate what he says and what he's
Oh,
saying.
wow.
The fact that there's nothing more moral. He says, for example, he says, well, and this is one of his basic illustrations of how there can be morality, even though he's just said that there can't be. He says, well, when you have a broken car on the road, this is a paraphrase, you have a broken car on the road, don't leave it on the road to injure people. You take it off the road and you fix it or you put it in a garage. So this is one of his moral prescriptions. That's what we should do, right? Well, wait a second. Who's doing that? We don't
Yeah.
determine whether we fix a car or put it in the garage or even take it off the road. We do what we were determined to do. You
Right.
just told us Sapolsky neurons are firing this way, and the prefrontal cortex is doing this, and the amygdala is doing that, and this is what affects that. That's what's determining whether we take cars off the road. What do we have to do with it? Why are you saying we should take broken cars off the road, or we take them off the road and fix
Yeah.
them? We do if it's predestined. If we don't, it isn't. So his prescriptions, that his book is filled with prescriptions that assumes free will, just like Harris's.
That's interesting. 'Cause even with that, it sounds like even the fact of him having to tell people like, "Oh, when your car breaks down, take it off the road." It's like, isn't that pointless if everything's predetermined because they'll just do it regardless if you tell them or not?
Exactly. You can't have it both
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
Well, determinists can have it both ways, but that doesn't mean it's a coherent position.
They want to eat their cake and have it too.
How's this one? Harris says you can change your life and yourself through effort and discipline. Page 38.
Wow.
You can change yourself. You can change your life and yourself through effort and discipline. Really? In a determined universe? When causes are responsible for everything we say and do, every action we take, every
Sounds
thought
like
that we have?
sounds like he forgot his own point.
Well, it sounds like he forgot something. How can we change our lives if we don't control our thoughts and actions?
Yeah.
How can we change ourselves? And how can we use effort and discipline? We use effort and discipline, or we think we are, if we're
Hmm.
caused to believe we are, or if we're caused to believe we have it and are exercising it. We're not any more in control of effort and discipline as we are of anything else, if you're a
Hmm.
true determinist. So these are statements that contradict determinism and presume free will and ratify free will and endorse free will. And they're all through determined and free will.
Hmm.
Here's another good one from Harris. I'm picking on Harris, but I will come across some from Sapolsky somewhere. He says, the freedom to do what one intends is no less valuable than it ever was. What? Let's hear it again.
Yeah, please.
The freedom to do what one intends is no less valuable than it ever was. What freedom? You said that our mental life is given to us by the cosmos. You said our thoughts and actions are determined. What freedom are you talking about? All of a sudden, we zapped into a world in which we have free will. What are you talking about, Harris? You
Yeah.
can't, you can't have it both ways. And I love it where it says it's no less valuable than it ever was. Well, if our thoughts are determined, then what we believe is valuable is what we're caused to believe has value.
Yeah.
There's no exception for determinist principles. There's no exception for truth claims that determinists make
Hmm.
about how reality works. They're just as determined as anyone else's beliefs. Valuable freedoms in a world in which all of our thoughts are causally compelled by physical forces.
Hmm.
What the hell is that about? Who's having to have it both ways? My rephrasing of that, consistent with
Hmm.
determinist principles, is in other words, you'd have to make the claim consistent with determinist principles. If you're a determinist, you would have to
Yeah.
say, you can't say we have valuable freedoms. You'd have to say we are causally compelled to believe we
Hmm.
have valuable freedoms and that we can follow our intentions but these are illusory experience caused by predestined physical forces.
Hmm.
That's what you have to say if you're a determinist. You can't say the freedom to do what we intend is as valuable as it ever was. Not in a deterministic universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I gotta
Yeah.
find one Polsky somewhere here, right? Oh, here's one. He's talking about morality.
Hmm.
To go back to, how do you square this thing, this determinist principle with morality and ethics? How does it fit into the determinist doctrine that all of our thoughts and actions are determined,
Yeah.
predestined, bang, or the result, Sapolsky would say, the result of biological forces mixed with environment? How do you square that? Well, I don't know. Let's see what he says. He says, the approach that makes the most sense to me is the idea of quarantine. The public needs to be protected, justifying the constraint on freedom, and should be done in a way that constrains the least. Hold on a second. What did he just say? What did he just say? Neuronal activity determines what we believe. Everything that we think was programmed by biology mixed with environment. But this approach makes the most sense to him. Why
Hmm.
would that? Well, under determinist doctrine, it would be because he was caused to believe it makes the most sense by forces that are
Yeah.
not within his control. So that justifies a quarantine. He says the public needs to be protected. Well, if the universe is predetermined, if everything happens as it must based on prior conditions and the laws of the universe, what the heck does it mean that we have the ability to protect the public? The public needs to
Hmm.
be protected. Well,
Hmm.
it can't be protected. It's protected to the extent it was predestined to be protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to the extent we think we're going about protecting people, taking cars off the road or otherwise, that was predestined too. We
Hmm.
can't protect anyone or anything. It's all been predetermined. Can't have it both ways. But the rest of his statement is
Hmm.
these constraints on freedom should be done in a way that constrains the least. Who's going to be doing that? Who's going to be making the judgment that this is the way to go that constrains liberty to the least in order to protect the public? Who's making that decision? Nobody,
Hmm.
because we don't make decisions under determinist law.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, he makes a statement that only makes sense with the presumption that we have free will. And suddenly we're in a free will
Wow.
universe.
Well, I am curious too. So with this idea of determinism, what does that do? Do they have any? I don't know if they've ever been pushed on this, but the idea of probability. When we look at even making determinations of how likely something is to happen,
Mhm.
doesn't that kind of all get tossed out the window? All those ideas and thoughts, or even like calculations, if everything is predetermined, there is no probability. It's just going to happen.
Well, that's an interesting point. Um, the first thing I have to say is that Sapolsky and Harris do get this one right. If the world is probabilistic, it doesn't help free will. We can't control probabilistic outcomes.
Mm,
We can't control them any more than deterministic outcomes. They're random. They do what they want. There's no reason why one probabilistic outcome manifests other than another.
mm,
Another could have manifested. That's the nature of probability.
mm,
One manifests, who knows why? Was it more probable? Yes, but it didn't have to manifest anyway.
hmm.
So what they say, and they get right, is that, hold on a second, probability doesn't affect, it's not, doesn't support, it doesn't affect the free will issue because it's something we can't control. And to have free will, we're looking
Interesting.
for control over reality to
Oh,
some
I see.
degree, within constraints, within conditions, subject to limits. We're looking for control.
Okay, that makes
So
sense.
that's the part they get right. The part that they
Huh.
don't get right, that I think you might have been alluding to a second ago, the part that they don't get right is you can't keep making claims that the world is determined every which way, which they do, if they admit to the possibility or probability of random events. If you believe that
Yeah.
there random events exist, and there's no reason why any given probabilistic event manifests rather than another, and another one could have in its place, then each probabilistic event is sending the universe spinning off in another direction. because everything that follows
Hmm.
is, quote, determined based on that event manifesting. But another probabilistic event could have sent the universe off in another direction. So you can't keep
Yeah.
declaring that the universe was determined at the Big Bang. Harris says it was set. He uses the word set at the Big Bang, including all
Hmm.
future behavior. You can't keep saying that over and over again at the same time admitting that the universe consists of probabilistic events.
Yeah. Yeah.
Inconsistent. You either have to take determinism or you have to take the existence of probability in the universe. You don't get both.
Right. Yeah.
Probability means that by definition, what happens now wasn't necessarily determined at the Big Bang. In fact,
Yeah.
it was because it's based on a series of random events that are mixing with whatever might be causal. That's what they get wrong, the inconsistency.
Yeah, and that's what I was curious about when you said earlier too, the idea of that they allow for randomness, because it seems like something they wouldn't allow for.
Except that they have to, because quantum science is stuck. It's stuck between two narratives. And one
Mm.
of them is a deterministic narrative where if you don't look at systems, they evolve like waves pursuant to the Schrodinger equation. And it's a
Mm.
deterministic evolution. You can predict a future state of the wave by knowing the current state.
Mm.
But on the other hand, when you look at a system, you measure it, you observe it, whoa, the waves go away. And all of a sudden we have a different narrative and there's only particles. Waves are gone, particles, and they behave probabilistically, not deterministically.
Mm.
Schrodinger equation isn't enough. That's subject to debate. And there's other rules, like the Born rule, that allows you to calculate probabilities based on the Schrodinger equation.
Mm.
So they're stuck because quantum science doesn't know. Science doesn't know
Mm.
whether the world is deterministic or probabilistic. These twin narratives have never been resolved.
Mm.
It's called the measurement problem, which is really a series of problems at the heart of quantum mechanics. Science doesn't know. As a result of not being able to solve the measurement problem,
Mm.
there are proposals, by the way, but there's no consensus on that. It doesn't know whether the universe is determined or probabilistic, but determinists know. Somehow they know
Mm.
what science concedes it doesn't know. That's pretty interesting.
That's very interesting.
I mean,
Yeah.
you'd think that if you want to make an argument that the universe is determined, you better have some scientific support for the
Yeah.
proposition that the world really is determined. Well, there's some support for it, and there's a lot of support that it's not. The jury's out. There's no decision. And determinism presumes that this decision has been made. And guess what? It's been made favorably to determinist doctrine. Imagine that. Imagine
Behold.
that.
What a surprise. I am curious. You brought up the it was the double slit experiment, right? We're talking about the
Well,
waves
I
and the
didn't bring it up,
particles.
but yeah, that's the typical example given for wave particle duality. The fact that sometimes things behave like waves, and reality seems to consist of waves.
Hmm.
Namely, when you're not looking at how a system's mechanically working, and then you look at it, you observe it, you measure it, and then all of a sudden there are particles. And that's demonstrated in the double slit experiment, where particles are sent at a screen with slits in it. And if you don't look, they form wave-like bands when they land at the back screen. And when you look, you put a monitor on, suddenly there are clumps of particles. Well, which is it? And
So
why did
weird.
looking at it, why did looking, observing, putting a monitor there, did that change the universe from waves into particles?
Yeah.
This is the quandary at the heart of the measurement problem.
And it's like
Science
at the face of it, me as a moron, it's like it sounds like there was an influence on it by someone looking at it. But then you have so actually because I looked it up on just Google as well. I was like, let me see what other people say about this. Because I was interested by the claim that you make in your book about it. Um and everyone that I saw, probably determinists, they left out the part about the influence of it, the observation. I found that very fascinating. Where it's like it seems like the results are kind of being uh, edited, if you will, to kind of influence or to lead more to what they want it to mean at the very end of it. I say, have you
Well,
noticed that yourself looking through that?
well, it depends on the type of determinist you are. As I
Mm,
was saying, there's three basic, well-known, most talked about interpretations of quantum mechanics, none of which are gospel, none of which are agreed upon.
mm,
And one of them is that the world is deterministic. And crazily enough, it splits off and branches into multiple worlds on each time we measure something or choose something or there's an outcome. The world splits and every single possible outcome manifests in a billion different worlds,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Instantly, immediately. And then those worlds, all the outcomes in those are splitting off into billions and trillions of other worlds. And so that's one vision, you could call it,
Mm,
of a deterministic universe compatible with the laws of quantum mechanics, in
mm,
particular the Schrodinger equation. And there's another one that's deterministic. It's called pilot wave theory. It has to do with waves evolving deterministically, but pushing particles that are always present
mm,
in the right direction. That has its own set of problems. Again, none of these have any kind of scientific consensus, and all of them have problems that have been pointed out by advocates of the other theories. And
yeah,
then there's
yeah.
and then there's a probabilistic one that has to do with a spontaneous collapse of they call it collapse of the wave function, so that this wave-like
Mm,
deterministic evolvement becomes spontaneous based not on what we look and our observations, of how our observations happen to catch them every time they happen. You might wonder about that. But it's a probabilistic non-determinist theory, but it's also not dependent on our observing what's going on.
mm,
Einstein, who didn't like quantum mechanics very much, but which he actually founded in 1905. A lot of people don't know that he was the precursor or the seminal thinker in quantum mechanics in
mm,
some experiments he did around the turn of the century and some papers he wrote. But in any case, he didn't like what happened, what developed with quantum mechanics, especially about the interpretations. And he said about what you said about what our observations are changing something. He said, what, can a mouse change the world?
mm,
Mouse looks at something and boom, waves become particles. What are you talking about?
mm,
So to sort of sum up, it really depends on what the determinist theory is about quantum mechanics, um, in terms of whether they're distorting the results of the double slit experiment. Because what you believe about the double slit experiment and the mechanics of what's going on and what it says about reality depends on whether you're an Everettian, which is the many worlds, multiple split off branches, billions of views happening every
mm.
time something, or was it 7,000 times per second per individual? I can't recall, something like that.
A lot.
Or whether you're a pilot wave theorist, or whether you're a GRW theorist, a family of spontaneous collapse theories. So
Mm,
they're not entirely inconsistent, but they interpret the issue, the quantum phenomena, the double slit
mm.
phenomena, and so forth, in accordance with their interpretation or their view of what quantum science is disclosing about reality. If you look at it within that frame, they're not necessarily being inconsistent.
Okay. So that's good to know. At least we're not being lied to.
Oh, but the bottom line is it's a mystery. Nobody knows the answer to the measurement
Mm,
problem. There is no answer. And that's one of the problems with determinism, is it presumes so many answers to scientific questions that don't exist. It presumes to know the answers to unresolved scientific mysteries.
mm,
Presumes that we
mm.
know the universe is deterministic. We were talking earlier. Science hasn't determined that the universe is deterministic or probabilistic or what, you know?
The jury's still out.
The top three theories are in conflict about it, and there's 25 other theories
Mm,
beneath those that are in conflict about it. And they all have different formalizations and different math and different outcomes. Science doesn't know at this point, but determinists know. You
mm.
know, somehow they
I'm
they
glad
know.
someone figured it out, you know?
Someone figured it out. They're on the forefront.
Yeah, right.
Determinists are on the forefront, and it's my reluctance to admit it.
The universe just hasn't decided to let us know yet.
No, we're in the dark.
Yeah.
They're
Well,
drinking the strawberry margaritas, and we're sipping beer. It's
Dark
just,
Ages over
life is
here.
unfair, it's just unfair. But it's astounding when you think about it, of the fundamental principles, scientific, philosophical, that popular determinist advocacy, I should say, not any type of determinist advocacy, just takes for granted and skips past, blows out as if there's no such problems.
Hmm.
And it's really selling a bill of goods. That sounds rather inflammatory, but it really is. If you don't know what causation is, and science doesn't know, and we can get into the problems with causation, which is determinist's number one premise.
Hmm.
If you know what that is, how are you going to make claims that the world is determined? Well, you can ignore the problems involved in causation. If you don't know what matter is, right? Science doesn't know what matter
Yeah.
is. This relates to the double slit experiment. Is it a
Hmm.
wave? Is it a particle? Is it both? Is it neither? Is it a quantum field? Is it a
Hmm.
vibration of a string? Science doesn't know what matter is.
Hmm.
Now, that's pretty amazing because causation, determinism's fundamental premise, has to work through something. It works through matter, whatever it
Yeah.
may be. And if you don't know what matter is, you don't know what causation is working through. And if you
Wow.
don't know what it's working through, how can you know the mechanics of what causation really is?
Hmm.
Determinists somehow presume that we know what matter is, but science doesn't know, and it concedes it doesn't know. And the double slit experiment is an example of why it doesn't know. And the measurement problem is an expression of why it doesn't yet know the
Yeah.
nature of. But popular advocacy like Harris and Sapolsky just cut through these problems, dismiss them, they don't exist, they're not on the radar, they don't get attention, and they don't inform their reader
Hmm.
that they're serious scientific and philosophical problems.
Hmm.
They're selling a Ferrari with the engine of a Toyota.
Wow.
And that assumes there's an engine under the hood to begin with.
They just got rid of the parts that didn't make
Let's give
sense.
them the benefit of the doubt.
So Harris mentions a lot of neuroscience tests. I know you brought some of those up too, and they talk about that there are tests that demonstrate that our thoughts are caused by some neural activity. But
Right.
I know in the book you say that he's misquoting the studies.
I wouldn't say he's misquoting him in the sense of not using the precise words from the studies.
Mm,
He's representing the studies. He's painting a selective and misleading picture of the neuroscience studies.
okay.
He presents three studies, okay? None of them endorse determinism.
Hmm.
Not entirely true. The author of one of them does, but it was his first study, and he repudiated the idea that these neural impulses cause our thoughts in a subsequent study.
Hmm.
But other studies, and ultimately the author of the first study, they don't endorse determinism. They don't say that these neural activity causes our thoughts. And
Whoa.
as a matter of fact, they set forth correlations, not causations, but correlations between these neural blips that happen fractions of a second before a subject is thinking they decide. And we'll come back to that because that's a
Hmm.
measurement that's been discredited,
Really?
completely discredited.
Whoa.
But put that aside for a second.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, the studies don't find causal correlations. As a matter of fact, the studies disprove causation. They do
Hmm.
exactly the opposite. The findings show the exact opposite of what Harris suggests.
It's
You
awkward.
know, they don't find causal relations. They find 60% correlation, 65%. One
Wow.
finds 80%, but there's all kinds of methodological problems with that study, which
Hmm.
you, which we don't need to talk about, but which you can read. It's a famous study. But none of them, I mean, causal relations, you have to find 100% correlations or 95% if you discount for operator error and machine technicality, so
Hmm.
technology
Hmm.
limits and so forth. No, we're talking 60, 70%, sometimes 75.
Wow.
Once or once in a while, maybe the only time 80, based on three test subjects, three test subjects. Let's move on. You, you're going to make global metaphysical claims based on three test subjects? Really? Really?
That's I don't, that's not even considered a small study.
It's a small study. It's a
Yeah,
small
it's
and
tiny.
humble study. It's humble, but it's being used to make global metaphysical claims, or at least to support them. Now,
Wow.
Sapolsky's far more sober about this, but he's also more schizophrenic about it. In a number of places, he says, "Oh, those studies don't prove much. They're artificial conditions, and they just prove correlations. And he mentions the fact that some of the correlations are so
Hmm.
beneath causal levels. If anything, they prove the lack of causation.
Hmm.
Uh, so,
Hmm.
so he says that, but then in other places later on in the book, he says the opposite. And I've put some of these quotes together in my book. He says,
Yeah.
well, we learned in chapter such and such that the PFC activity causes this, that thought. And it's like, wait a second. And he's referring to the neuroscience studies. So in some places they don't mean much. In other places, we've learned that they mean that our thoughts are caused by this neural activity.
So he definitely seems to jump back and forth based on what's more
He's a little
convenient.
Yeah, I think he's a little bit confused about what he's really thinking about the tests. I think on the whole, he doesn't believe that they amount to much. But
Hmm.
then, rhetorically speaking, he uses them
Okay.
with causal abandon,
Hmm.
you might say, to show that, oh, we've learned that, and then the proposition is that these neural impulses cause thoughts and behavior. But they don't. Now, there's other
Yeah.
problems with tests. We're just beginning. Aside from the fact that they don't have any correlations that approach the causal level, aside from the
Hmm.
fact disprove neural brain causation by the lack of causal correlation, the central measurement has been discredited.
Whoa.
It's been shown to be wildly inaccurate by other neuroscience tests. The
Really?
problem, yeah, the problem is that this fMRI or whatever the imaging thing is recording when the neural impulse starts to increase. Okay.
Okay.
Subject is looking at clocks or looking at timing devices and is supposed to mark the moment. Well, this, depending on the study, it's written differently, which is another set of problems, but the urge to move the finger. All of these studies, by the way, parenthetically, I should have said this first, are based on simple motor movements, a wrist flick, a finger
Oh.
pushing a button. Okay. This isn't, even where to go to dinner, let alone what house to buy or where to send your daughter to school. Okay. These are deliberative decisions. And there's a lot of papers about this saying these aren't decisions at all. But
Mm.
put that aside, which is another problem. Okay. The subjects can't determine with any degree of accuracy, cannot determine, no pun intended, within any degree of accuracy when that tiny little urge to move or making that decision, first
Mm.
becoming aware of it, occurs. I mean, you're talking about tenths of seconds. The
Yeah.
author
Yeah.
who kicked this all off, the author who kicked this all off, Benjamin Libet, in the early 80s, and the author who about whom I said Harris cites him, but in fact he repudiated his initial findings. And Harris notes that in a footnote, but then doesn't mention it in the text, in which
Mm.
he's championing neural brain determinism. In any case, the moment that the subject decides can't be determined.
Mm.
And Libet, in his reversal, said, no, actually, we have a veto power that happens after this neural impulse starts rising. Okay.
Convenient.
Convenient. By the way, another parenthetical. Harris put out a best of Sam Harris series in the last couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years.
Mm.
And he has lectures on various subjects, politics and otherwise. And he has lectures on free will, or at least one.
Mm.
Doesn't mention the science test. They're gone. They're,
Really?
they're a healthy chapter in his book. He comes to the conclusion that our brains indisputably, that's his word, indisputably make our decisions before we're aware of what we'll do next. That's almost a verbatim quote, if
Wow.
not. These tests show that our brains make our decisions indisputably moments before we're aware of what we'll do next, what we'll do next. So,
Strong statement.
strong statement. Well, where are the tests? They're missing. They're not in
Wow.
best of series lecture on free will. Why is that? Well, who knows? At the end of the program, you have to wait to find out. Big cliffhanger. A narrator comes along and says, "You'll notice that the science tests, the neuroscience studies are missing. They're not mentioned."
Mm.
Yeah, kind of noticeable, since that's one of the pillars he's been hanging his free will argument on for a decade.
And they're not even in there.
Exactly, they're gone. And she says something like, again, a paraphrase, he took them out because they're highly controversial. Really? Okay, well, they're no more controversial than the day he wrote Free Will.
Wow.
There's a long line of neuroscience studies I didn't even mention, which criticize those three tests, which have other explanations for
Hmm.
why there's even low correlations. There's other explanations, other things going on in the brain. These explanations, the neural impulse and the urge to move as subjectively determined, don't line up in various ways. There's all kinds of
Hmm.
have discredited that, which Harris doesn't mention. Come back to that for a second. So at the end of his best of series, a narrator comes along and says, you'll notice these tests weren't mentioned or weren't included, and that's because they're controversial. But
Hmm.
as I said, all of those contrary line of findings that I just mentioned, they were all out, or most of them were out. The
Wow.
vast majority were out when he wrote the thing. He just ignored them. He decided to put in three tests, one from an author who repudiated the position, which he acknowledged in a footnote for other reasons. I'll give
Hmm.
him credit for acknowledging it, but not for the reasons which we could go into. In any case, doesn't mention these contrary studies. But then at the end of this narrator's programmatic footnote about the fact that he's not mentioning the neuroscience studies anymore,
Hmm.
says something to the effect of, Harry has nothing to do with this, just to be clear. Harris, Sammy, he
Oh,
commend,
Sammy.
he commends the Libet test, which I mentioned was that seminal test in 1984 by
Hmm.
Benjamin Libet, the guy who repudiated the causal connection later on with his subsequent veto
Hmm.
studies.
Yeah.
He commends the Libet test to the audience because it's very interesting. I think the word she uses, or Harris says, is very interesting.
Hmm.
So now you have 10 years later, he's pulled the studies out, but he's commending the one test to the readers without mentioning the fact that the author repudiated the test,
Wow.
without mentioning that the central measurement of all these tests has been discredited by numerous science studies.
Huh.
Even mentions some of those studies in the footnotes, without mentioning there's a relevance problem. Is a button push or a flick of a finger really like decision about when to ask your boss for a raise and how much deliberate decisions? It's a relevance question.
Yeah.
Without mentioning the fact that there's dozens of contrary studies which say that that neural impulse, it's called the RP, or readiness potential,
Hmm.
that the RP isn't what's, quote, causing the subsequent thought or urge or impulse or decision.
Hmm.
There's
Hmm.
other things going on. Doesn't mention any of that, but commends the Libet test,
Wow.
the first repudiated Libet test for the audience's interest because it's interesting. Well, what's
Hmm.
that about? What's that about?
That's so I have to ask. And I say this with as much respect as I can. Oh, what's that?
I said, what is that about?
Oh,
That was,
exactly. Do you think he knows and he's intentionally doing that, or do you think it is out of ignorance?
I don't think it's either. I mean, I think he's a knowledgeable, smart guy, and when he
Yeah.
he put in the tests, one presumes that he believed in them.
Mm.
One would think because he's a neuroscientist that, or has a degree in neuroscientist, that he knew about these contrary studies. So I can't explain why he would be so terribly selective,
Right.
but I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that he's, misrepresenting in an intentional sense.
I'd hope
But
not. Yeah.
but he should know. I wouldn't think so, but because he doesn't seem like that kind of guy. He seems like a straight up kind of a guy.
Yeah.
But but in the recent best of series, when he deletes the test and then commends the one repudiated test without mentioning all these problems,
Hmm.
you have to wonder about the extent to which he's paying attention, or the extent to which he
Yeah.
wishes to be conscientious, um, because one would think the speech he might have made at that point was, I've taken them out because I've come to realize that there's a number of conflicting studies
Hmm.
and a number of studies which discredit the central measurement. And there's a lot of reason, and the correlations that these tests disclose, this is extremely important, maybe the most important thing. The
Mm,
correlations prove that there's a lack of causation. 65% correlation isn't causation.
yeah.
75% not causation. 80% is not causation.
Yeah.
Okay, they disprove a causal connection. He could have said the correlations aren't sufficient for causation. He could have said that the first time. But in this disclaimer that he took them out because they're controversial, how about saying what it really is?
Mm,
It's that he realized they may be controversial. They were controversial then, but he realized that there's too much descending beliefs. There's correlations that don't amount to causation,
mm,
that prove the lack of causation, that there's relevance questions about whether simple motor movements, et cetera, et cetera.
mm.
One would do that. Again, do I think he's misleading intentionally? No, but something's going on that isn't servicing his readers and isn't servicing being conscientious and forthright about what's really out there, which he should know.
Yeah.
I'm not going to jump to the
Yeah.
conclusion say he's misrepresenting intentionally, because he doesn't seem to be that kind of a person, and I wouldn't put that on.
Okay, that's good to know. Because if I remember right, because you were a pretty big fan of his before this book, or maybe still just not this this ideas that he presents.
Yeah, I'm a fan of his about everything except for his views on free will and his views about morality in that moral landscape. But I
Yeah.
generally agree on most other things, politics and otherwise.
Is this is his books on this, him and Sapolsky both, is that kind of what got you interested in doing your own self-study on this?
Yeah, Free Will did. Harris's book did. I picked it up one day because I liked his other books and scratched my head in puzzlement and said, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. Maybe it's me. Maybe
Mm,
I'm ignorant, but these aren't arguments. These are circular and they're repetitive and they're conclusory. So maybe I'm missing something.
mm.
And I decided to write an article, which became a long article, which became a short book, which became a longer book. But it was inspired by scratching my head and saying, generally, I like what Sam Harris has to say, and generally, I'm in accord with him, but this doesn't make sense. What does he
Mm,
think? What is he thinking? Is it me?
mm.
Which I could have found out it was.
Yeah, true.
And in fact, the most impressive thing in that first read of Free Will was the science test. I said to myself, my
Mm,
gosh, if there's a neural impulse going off every time, right before we think we're deciding,
yeah.
wow, we're deciding that neural impulse is causing the decision.
Mm,
That was that, by the way, that's
mm.
another problem with these tests I didn't even mention because there's so many. It's interpretation. Let's say that neural impulse is going off absolutely every time. What do you
Yeah.
make? Why is it a cause? What makes it a cause? There's
Mm,
other there's other theories which Harris doesn't mention that have to do with preparatory activities.
mm.
You know you're going to make a decision. You had an intention when you walked in the science lab to participate in the test and to follow the
Yeah.
rules and to do as instructed. And here it comes now. It's the time. You're on the hot seat,
Mm.
literally on the seat, and you're strapped down and you're looking at a clock and you know you're going to watch for something. And these are all intentions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the intentions which predate that little blip that the MFRI machine is picking up. Well, where
Right.
did those go? You know, why would you interpret that moment as the start of a causal chain? Why would you interpret that neural impulse at the start as causal? This might
Mm,
be preparatory activities.
mm.
Your fingers tensing, your brain's thinking, you're looking out for things. There's mental events going on long before that neural blip. Some of them we think of
Yeah.
as intentions. So there's that. Add it to the list, rack it up.
Fascinating. Just keep on going.
Anybody who refers to those tests for the proposition that the brain indisputably makes our decisions before we're aware of it or before we're aware of what we'll do next,
Mm,
misrepresenting what the tests say. You can go to Wikipedia. There's articles on Libet. Look up Libet or look
mm.
up Neuroscience Studies Free Will. And there'll be dozens of these articles. And you can read every one of them. You don't even have to read them. Your reader should just go turn to the conclusions. They're all available online. Turn to the conclusions and see what they say.
Yeah. Yeah.
None of them say we have found causal relationships that demonstrate a causal connection between neural activity, and even the most pro-determinist tests don't say that.
Wow.
The Freed test, the one that
Wow.
has the 80% correlation that I mentioned, says at the end of it, the relationship between, again, paraphrasing, the relationship between neural impulses and decisions is subject to contention.
Hmm.
Know enough about it, you know? So,
Wow.
so, so even the most pro leaning of neuroscientists is conceding that it's an open question and that the test doesn't offer findings that offer any definitive direction as to where the answer lies.
Wow. Well, so I am curious because then that kind of leaves the door open for some of the criticisms on the free will side of things. And so let me ask, what are some of the challenges of defining and measuring free will scientifically?
Well, the definitional thing isn't a challenge. You either
Yeah.
say that it means, well, let me take it back. I was going to say, you say what common sense suggests, that we're free to form intentions and make decisions and take actions subject to constraints and boundaries and limits. Okay. You can take that definition and run with it as for scientific study.
Hmm.
Um, but it depends on your definition of free will and whether you
Hmm.
want to water it down to what compatibles think is free will. You could do that. So it depends on the definition that you start out with.
Okay. So we'll assume common sense. What
Common sense.
everyone's
Well,
probably going to say. Yeah.
yeah, and here's the problem. Determinists, some of whom are scientists, um, uh, will say that, and Sean Carroll says this, a noted a cosmologist and physicist. He says, "Oh, free will is would have to violate the laws of physics."
Hmm.
And this is a common notion among determinists. Why would it have to violate the laws of physics? Well, because they behave in a certain way. The subatomic particles react to forces that have to do this pursuant to Newtonian or relativistic laws, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And that's just what happens. Well, that's pretty circular. I
Yeah.
mean, free will would violate the laws of physics because the laws of physics are deterministic. That's what the argument amounts to. Well, okay, you can win an argument that way, but I don't know how much you're winning.
You're
So
right. I
there's
can
this
prove you're wrong
notion.
because I'm right.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. It sounds very bold, very determined, no pun intended, very forceful, very sure of itself. But there's this notion that goes to the question you're asking, that free will has to violate the laws of physics. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
violate the laws of physics. If free will exists, and any free will advocate would concede, it would have to be a natural phenomenon. It's part of the universe. It's part of the
Right.
laws of physics. We don't know what they are yet, but we don't know
Hmm.
if the world is probabilistic or determined.
Hmm.
We don't know why there's wave-like particle and sometimes particle-like particle behavior. We don't know. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
things we scratch the surface of that. We could go on, but there is this notion, and it's a straw man. It's a detour.
Hmm.
Free will advocates don't believe that free will has to violate the laws of physics. They believe it's a perfectly natural phenomenon, which we
Yeah.
can't yet explain. And there's no reason to believe it isn't unless you presume the world is determined.
Yeah, which we can't prove or disprove one way or the other. Same with either argument.
Well, the problem is we can never, because of the self-contradiction involved in claiming that we don't control our thoughts and actions. As soon as we
Hmm.
divorce our thoughts and our beliefs about what's true from any objective measure,
Hmm.
kind of criteria based on reason, then we have no way to justify them.
Hmm.
You know, Sam Harris has a perfect prediction machine thought experiment in his book where he says, suppose there's a machine that can read your thoughts moments before you have them, and it can perfectly predict what you're going to do moments before. Wouldn't that
Hmm.
predict evidence of free will? Here we have scientific test conditions. And the answer to that is it wouldn't prove anything.
Hmm.
Nothing at all. Because the test is a metaphor for the same contradiction we've been talking about.
Wow.
You're going to argue that you have to argue that the machine whose findings you believe in, right? You're claiming there is a machine. That's a truth claim.
Yeah.
Its findings are accurate. That's a truth claim. You're presuming that the operator knows how to use it and there's no fraud, et cetera, et cetera. These are all truth claims or truth presumptions. And then you're saying that we don't have any control over our thoughts because the machine can predict what they're going to be. So,
Hmm.
in other words,
Hmm.
the machine predicted beforehand that you were going to believe in the machine. You're back in the same contradiction. Once you undermine truth by divorcing beliefs about truth from any rational basis, if you reduce them to causal effects, physical events, you have no basis to believe in the machine or anything else. It's a contradiction.
Hmm.
And what are these
Hmm.
physical events? Here's something that you don't hear determinists tackling or addressing. What are these physical events that are supposed to be controlling us anyway? Well, they're
Yeah.
physical. They don't think, they don't reason, they don't have a moral sense,
Hmm.
don't perceive, they don't know what concepts are. They wouldn't know an ethical precept if it whacked them in the nose or whacked them in the quark. They're physical events.
Hmm.
So determinists have to answer the following question, which they don't ask. Again, I'm referring to popular discourse, let's say, for the moment. How is it that these physical events, whether determined or random or some combination, how is it they are behaving, that they're forming themselves into patterns based on reason and
Hmm.
meaning, significance, and there are self-contained logical systems like logic and mathematics and syntax? Why
Hmm.
would physical events be organizing themselves on the basis of meaning?
Hmm.
Meaning has nothing to do with the laws of physics. It's not involved in the laws of physics. Significance is a concept. Physical
Hmm.
events know what concepts are.
Hmm.
So why are physical events swirling around and forming the works of Shakespeare and
Yeah.
concepts based on meaning and frameworks of ideas? It's nonsensical to think that
Hmm.
that's physical phenomena. I mean, why would that be happening? Of course, we're using reason to question why, as our as our determinists who are making truth claims in questioning this. But it makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Physical laws that say that quarks and leptons and bosons are flying around organizing themselves in accordance
Hmm.
with mathematics or organizing themselves in accordance with syntax or
Yeah.
no such thing in the laws of physics. And yet this force is controlling the universe. Well, what force?
Hmm.
Isn't gravity, isn't electromagnetic?
Hmm.
What is it? It's not a nuclear force, small or large.
Interesting.
Those are the forces of nature.
Yeah.
What is going on? Why are these molecules and quarks and so forth acting this way? Not because of the laws of physics. You want to argue that everything is determined, that everything reduces to unthinking physical events. Unthinking physical events, you better have an explanation for why unthinking physical events are creating ideational structures based on
Hmm.
concepts. They don't know what concepts are.
Yeah. Yeah.
The issue just doesn't surface in popular discourse. You won't see it in free will. You won't see it in determined. You won't see it in order
Hmm.
to say it's a bad argument. It's just not considered, as are most of the serious arguments that you're hearing here. I don't say serious, the important arguments,
Yeah.
the arguments that you have to answer in the free will debate if you want to have a serious debate about it.
Hmm.
They're not questioned in popular
Hmm.
discourse. So why are quarks writing Shakespeare? That's pretty weird behavior. Can't be
Yeah.
just under the laws of physics. There's no Shakespearean law. I mean, it's just not part. It's just not another force with a strong and weak nuclear and electromagnetic and gravity. It's just not a force called Shakespearean force in the laws of physics.
And that well, it's weird because it seems like you have to argue then that, which it sounds like that's what you're saying, is that these things, if they're just unfeeling, unthinking particles, for lack of a better word, then yeah, it makes no sense. So then you have to argue that they have some kind of moral or sentient thought to instill in other people for us to just do the things. And that doesn't make any sense either.
Well, they argue that thoughts are and mental life from the cosmos are epiphenomenon. They're caused by physical events.
Mm,
But then you have the problem, really? So that thought was
yeah.
too. On what basis are you saying that? Because your neurons compelled you to say it.
Mm,
You know, they could say, for example, that there are biological reasons that select for pattern recognition. Can't
mm,
survive if you don't know that the lion's over here and the giraffe's over there, and better take the path away from the lion's den. So
mm,
there's biological adaptive purposes. They could say that, but it's the same question. Why? Why would why would
yeah.
electrons and quarks and so forth, why would they be forming purposeful survival techniques?
Yeah.
You know, and if they're not purposeful, if they're random, then what gives you the right to say that they're true if your thoughts are compelled? So
Mm,
it's all one circle. It's all
yeah.
one big circle. And the bottom line is, how are you going to ever prove, which was your question, I think,
Yeah.
behind at the beginning of these meanderings, your question was, well, what about scientific proof? You know, you
Yeah.
can't you can't prove determinism if you concede that you are surrendering control over your thoughts and actions, whether it's the subatomic particles or the initial state of the universe or your birth conditions or your fetal conditions or
Mm.
any of the things that Sapolsky cites, your genetics and so forth. You concede control of your thoughts to those and you're toast. You just can't justify
Mm.
determinism.
It seems like in and of itself, it like you said, it just seems contradictory in that it seems to fall so short when we look at what we see in reality. It doesn't answer the questions that it thinks it's answering.
No, it doesn't. And it undermines its ability to say anything objective, to say anything truthful.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that it constantly misconstrues science. We haven't talked a lot about that. But
Mm.
the fundamental laws of the universe, here's one. The fundamental laws of the universe don't concern causation. They aren't based
Mm.
on causation. The fundamental physical laws of the universe have nothing to do with causation. Now
Mm.
that's pretty shocking because the allure of
Yeah.
determinism, what gives it its force, its power, makes it so readily appealable is the idea that that's what science is about. Science finds
Yeah.
causal connections. Science is based on causation. Well, guess what? It isn't.
Mm.
This isn't discussed in the popular advocacy. The
Mm.
laws of physics are dynamical laws. They're equations which track the evolution of systems as a whole. And they compare the
Mm.
state of a system in this state at time A to the state of a system at time B. They don't concern what the constituents of that state are doing. Okay, they're boundary constraints on what systems are doing and relative states of systems. That's not where causation lies. That's not where causal structures arise. And
Mm.
in fact, how the heck causal structures arise based on a universe governed by fundamental laws that are dynamical is an entirely complicated, difficult question in the
Yeah.
law of physics because there's no answer to why we're seeing causal patterns spin out themselves when under the fundamental laws there is no such thing. Everything that runs forward can run
Mm.
backwards.
Mm.
Anything that's possible going forwards, it's possible to go backwards. We don't see that, but that's what the laws of physics say.
Wow.
They're, they're called time symmetric or time
Mm.
invariant. But causation requires an arrow of time. It requires that time go forward.
Mm.
Physics doesn't know why time goes forward. It's
Mm.
an unanswered question with all kinds of complicated theories that involve entropy, disorder, being low at the beginning of the universe, and probabilistic equations between micro and macro states, and past hypothesis, and so forth. Very complex question, to which, by the way, determinists somehow have an answer, right? Because time does run forward, and it's a fundamental law of physics if you're a determinist, but it's not. It's not part
Mm.
of. And I'm not making this up. You know,
Wow.
Bertrand Russell in 1912 wrote an article on the notion of cause, and he said causation, very famous quote, he says, causation is a relic of a bygone age. It
Hmm.
sticks around like the monarchy. This is the paraphrase. It sticks around like the monarchy because it's presumed not to be an issue, not to be problematic, but it
Wow.
is, you know. So causation was banished from what he calls the advanced sciences over 100 years ago
Hmm.
because the fundamental laws of physics don't involve causation.
Wow.
And it's a scientific mystery as to why causal structures arise at all.
Wow.
So it's interesting. What? I thought science was based on causation. Well, you don't hear Harris talking about that. You don't hear Sapolsky talking about that. It's a real
Hmm.
question. I mean, their theory rises on the integrity of causal relations, the existence of causation, that we understand the meaning of causation. And there's so many problems with the notion of causation is that you don't get to first base, let alone around third heading home.
Wow.
And it's when I first read Harris's book, I thought, well, I don't know if it's that simple. Is it that simple, really?
Hmm.
And I'm here to say, after a fair amount of study, that it's not that simple. And
Yeah.
you can't, well, you can, but you can't just leapfrog over these open scientific questions that are highly complex.
Hmm.
You can't just assume that you know the answer to issues that science concedes it doesn't know. You
Yeah.
can't do. I
Hmm.
mean, you can. It's being done, but you can't do that if you really want to have a serious discussion about
Hmm.
whether the world is determined. And you have to confront the paradox of claiming that all my thoughts are determined and were set at the Big Bang, including this thought. You just can't not deal with it. You asked earlier, by the way, if anyone had confronted those guys with the notion.
Yeah.
And the answer is yes and no, but mainly
Hmm.
no. It's not raised in any of the discussions or the interviews that I've seen, Harris or Sapolsky.
Wow.
But it's one of the most important questions you have to ask in the free will debate.
Yeah.
How can determinism
Yeah.
have any pedigree when all of its claims are self-contradictory and self-defeating and violating the rules of logic? That's a question that really has to be asked.
I think that's the first question.
Could be the first question. You can't get past it.
Yeah.
Either it's a binary choice. Either truth has some objective basis. We're connected with something
Hmm.
which we can measure and have a criteria about truth claims, or everything is determined and our thoughts are causally compelled by physical events. And there's no way we can know if anything is true because we believe
Hmm.
true whatever we're caused to believe true.
Yeah.
Can't have it both ways.
Yeah. And it seems so much like they're trying to have both ways. 'Cause on one side, it's like, oh, here's the intellectual idea, but then real life tells us a different story. And it's like, well, how do we meld these two things together? And it doesn't seem like it can really happen.
It can if you don't care about contradiction or logic, or perhaps
Done.
plausibility or credibility.
What's that anyway?
I haven't talked about this before, but I think there's a real core of humanism in, well, both of them, but in Sapolsky's aversion to assigning blame or praise, because he's saying, look,
Mm.
it's in a
Mm.
number of places, in a number of ways. He says, look, basketball player, I'm giving my own examples, but it's the idea, look, we praise a basketball player for doing great, but he was born 6'4" and he didn't control that. And he has coordination that he didn't choose to have. There's so
Yeah.
much in our lives that influence us that most of our successes and most of our failures are based on conditions that we can't control. So
Mm.
why push people, and why give them social benefits, more
Mm.
money, less money, on the basis of things that they largely can't control? And there's a lot of merit to that position. But it doesn't mean there's
Mm.
not free will. It doesn't mean there's not free will. It just means that there's a lot of what we do is based on conditions and circumstances and traits that we don't control.
Mm.
And the question there is, do we have to control do we have to control everything? Of course not. or can be influenced by a whole lot of things, but that doesn't mean they control outcomes. That doesn't mean they control our decisions.
Right.
This is a fundamental error
Right.
that determinists make. They confuse influence with control, and they
Hmm.
aren't the same thing. We can be influenced by all kinds of things and still have the ability to have free will. Logically,
Hmm.
analytically, there's nothing that prevents us from having free will within a circle of profound influence. In fact, you have to. Free will has to be influenced. It has to take. It takes place in circumstances, not of its own making. It has to. It has to have boundaries and constraints to push against. You know,
Yeah.
Harris says in his book that in order to have free will, paraphrase, in order to have free will, we need to know and control all the factors that determine us. We have to know and control all the factors that
Hmm.
determine us. Well, that's pretty circular, but put that aside, okay? Let's assume that's the case and there's no circularity. Why would we have to? Why would we have to know
Right.
and control every factor? We operate in circumstances and we need to push against, we need to resist, we need to choose based on conditions that we did not create.
Hmm.
You know, free will,
Hmm.
ironically, needs the exact opposite of what Harris suggests. It needs not to control everything, because if it controlled everything, we'd be God.
Yeah.
If we could, we
Yeah.
could know and control all the factors that, quote, determine us or would determine us, we'd be God. Since when did free will require that we be omniscient and omnipotent? It doesn't. It's not what it means.
Hmm.
We all know that we exercise choice within boundaries and constraints and conditions and circumstances that aren't of our making. That's what it means to
Right.
exercise free will. We are exercising it in a context, in a physical context, in a mental context, in a
Hmm.
social context. Where does Harris and other determinists get the idea that it has to be pure and free and
Hmm.
in a vacuum and omniscient, and we have to control all the conditions, all the factors that determine us? It's nonsense. And Harris doesn't give any reason for it. He just
Hmm.
states it as a principle. What would we have to have free will, he says? Have
Hmm.
to go about and control all the factors that determine us. Why? No reason why. Doesn't give a reason, and there's no reason why. And as I say, opposite is the case. Free will can only exist if we don't control all those conditions, because it's on the
Yeah.
basis of that, things that are fixed, things that are given, things that we can't control. It's on the basis of those circumstances
Hmm.
free will is able to make decisions, assuming it exists. It needs the
Yeah.
opposite of what Harris is prescribing.
Hmm. That's fascinating.
Well, we can be God, I suppose, and God
Yeah.
has free will and then we don't, but that's not the position he's taking because he's one of the new atheists.
Yes, we can't take that one.
You can't take that one, not for Harris anyway.
But yeah, if you make free, the only way to have free will is for every person to control every aspect of their life, then it's like, well, in a way, it's like we kind of do have that. I guess you might argue, and to some degree, obviously the boundary, but the boundary is everybody has that, and we're butting heads with everyone's free decision, their free will every day. Where it's like, oh, I want to get to work on time. Well, so does everybody else who has to go to work. So that's why there's rush hour traffic because everyone's trying to make that free decision.
Mhm.
Um, and my will is butting up against someone else's will, whose will is butting up against somebody else's will. But it's like, but just because that exists doesn't mean there isn't free will. In a way, it means that there is.
Well, there's a lot of evidence that there is free will. It just depends on what kind of evidence you want to accept.
Mm.
Um, you could make the argument. I haven't thought about this much, but it recently occurred to me that you could flip the argument about why determinism doesn't work, and to say that, look, we're using meaning and significance.
Mm.
We're organized. Something is organizing our thoughts. Well, they're not being organized randomly. That would seem unlikely. No pun intended. And they're not being organized by the laws of physics because that doesn't concern macro events in the
Mm.
macro realm in which we're living, right? So what's left? What's left is free will.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you can say, well, no, it's all probabilistic, but then that thought becomes probabilistic and not based on truth either.
Hmm. Hmm.
So look, it's not as if there aren't problems with free will. It hasn't been scientifically validated. It does seem to go against some aspects of how reality manifests itself.
Hmm.
Um, there's issues with its incoherence, though I think that position is incoherent. But to choose a word, so it may not be the ideal candidate, but it's the only candidate by default, because otherwise you have to concede that you don't control your thoughts,
Hmm.
including being a determinist, the thought that determinism is the correct answer to the question. Well, you're caused to believe there's a question. There may not be. So it's a
Oh,
rabbit.
interesting.
So it's a rabbit hole. Well, it really is. I mean, once you free our thoughts from control, and once you unmoor them from anything objective or anything real or anything reasonable,
Hmm.
it's a rabbit hole. You know, who knows what's going on? Who knows if we're thinking these thoughts? That's
Yeah.
pretty. Are we thinking these thoughts, or are we being made to look back a half a second
Hmm.
and thoughts are being changed? I mean, everything's up for grabs if we don't control our thoughts, if there's no objective measure. And
Yeah.
every determinist principle is undermined, and every
Hmm.
determinist claim is self-defeating. You can't get around it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and man, it's you've given me a lot to think about for sure. And even all the things that you bring up, and I know there's probably 6 more hours of information that you have easily.
Well, again, this is the frustration that I think I and others share. There's no reason why Harris and Sapolsky can't address these issues.
Mm.
There's no reason why they can't have a serious discussion which is conscientious in terms of addressing the important issues that need to be addressed instead of skipping over them.
Yeah.
No reason why Harris can't give a sober assessment of the neuroscience studies to date.
Mm.
He may have to say,
Mm.
look, I was misled at the time, or in hindsight, more tests convinced me. That's fair enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's no reason he can't mention the correlation rates or the relevance issues of the problems. So there's the frustration that I think I and others have experienced in listening to this popular presentation of determinism is, these issues are out there. They're not made
Mm.
up. They're right before our faces. You
Yeah.
know, why not address them? Why not even address them in cooperation with how do we get past them? Can we get past them? I
Mm.
mean, how do causal structures arise? What are they? If the fundamental laws of the universe isn't based on them,
Mm.
you know,
Mm.
why? I mean, at least you could come to the honest conclusion after a real dialogue about it, a
Yeah.
dialogue that doesn't avoid the hard issues. You could come to the conclusion, at the very least, that we just don't know enough to know that it's an
Yeah.
open that it's an open question. I mean, it's open on the scientific front, it's open on the philosophical front. We
Yeah.
didn't go into philosophical issues, but you got a problem with Hume, who said that we don't
Mm.
see causation. We see regularity of appearances. We see constantly conjoined, those are his words, events that
Mm.
spill out in sequences, but they don't have to spill out that way the next time. There's no logical reason that
Mm.
they need to. We don't see causation. We don't see necessary connections. It's an expectation of the mind.
Mm.
Now, Hume's argument, is the starting point for all discussions about causation in academic circles and serious circles. They all start with Hume because nobody's put that argument to bed.
Mm.
Got to talk about that if you're making claims that the universe is based on causation.
Yeah.
Another philosophical area that we really didn't talk about, but I'll throw in a couple of
Yeah.
old
Please.
but goodies as a departing uh, contribution to how complex this issue really is Kant. Kant said
Mm.
that we have these categories of the mind. It's the way our minds are structured, and they filter sense data that comes into it. It's how we reconstruct or construct the world of sense data. The world is really out there, but how it's presented to us is a function of how the human mind is structured.
Yeah.
Well, that's a real
Hmm.
interesting problem. Whether you believe in his categories or not, the question is, to what extent are we contributing to how the universe presents ourselves?
Hmm.
Causal structures arise within a world whose fundamental laws are dynamical and
Hmm.
time-centric and don't support an arrow of time. Maybe there's some degree to which, being rhetorical, there's a contribution from the human mind that has to do with invoking, let's say, causal patterns in the universe. Not
Hmm.
patterns that aren't there. Not necessarily everything is all subjective kind of voodoo. Things are there, but they may appear causally in the context of causal structures, partly as a contribution of the human mind. That's an important issue in the free will debate,
Hmm.
because it
Hmm.
goes to the integrity of causation. Does causation really exist? What are its parameters? What's its scope? How do you define
Yeah.
it? What does it mean? And what are the causal mechanisms behind it? Especially when you don't know what the hell
Hmm.
matter is. So you got
Yeah.
Hume, you got Kant, you got Russell saying it's of no scientific relevance because of the dynamical laws which concern systems and don't concern causal relations among constituents. You got a whole bunch of problems here that could be talked about in
Hmm.
an open forum that really wants to explore in some conscientious and comprehensive fashion the issues here. It might take more than an hour or two. So what? You know,
Yeah.
it's not going to mislead the reader or the audience who's going to know that there's a whole thorny bunch of issues
Hmm.
behind this premises that so far have been swept under the rug in popular discourse. That's not a
Yeah.
way to see things. The alternative is
Yeah.
to have a real discussion about these issues, a more comprehensive view of the problem.
Yeah. And I think with having those open in, I mean, that's even what, we're trying to do here, which is why this is perfect to have you on to be able to share this is my belief is that when we do have those, honest, genuine conversations about these things and recognize that not everything's as cut and dry as some people might claim it to be or we might want it to be, that's when we actually have some growth, some innovation, and some positive change.
Well, we could end up with another alternative or a
Yeah.
combination of alternatives, among other things, if there was an honest exchange about the core issues involved in the free will debate. So far, there
Mm,
isn't an honest exchange in popular discourse in books like
mm,
Harris Sapolsky's.
hmm.
And that's a shame.
That is a shame. So one final question for you on that. I'm sure I'll have like 15 more, as I
That's
always
a
do.
shame. You should believe it's a shame. You should face the fact that it's a shame. You should appreciate the fact that it's a shame, even though your thoughts are determined and whether you appreciate it or not isn't up to you.
I was
I know
determined to
you
believe it was a shame.
me too. In fact, I'm ashamed to think of it. I'm
Oh no.
ashamed for having made the suggestion. What can I do? I'm determined. I'm determined to believe that I'm not determined.
Yeah.
Oth- Others are determined to believe it. Who am I to say? What I think about that has also been determined, as
Hmm.
far as I know. So that's the rabbit hole,
I
and
love it.
people should know what a hornet's nest this whole thing is, and what isn't being spoken that needs to be
Yeah.
spoken.
Yeah. And so that kind of actually leads into what I wanted to ask you. It was so what can we as listeners, as thinkers, what can we do to help um I guess add some of that genuineness or some of the honesty to this conversation?
Well, first you should write your congressman.
Okay.
And you should say, get off the ball and pass a law in which populi- popularizers of determinism have to speak comprehensively about the issues
Hmm.
involved and make
Hmm.
it illegal that they don't. Think of it as a broken car that you're taking off the road. Make this law, force them to deal with it.
I love it.
And a variation of that might be tell all your readers to get a hold of Sapolsky's books, read them,
Mm.
and ask them by email or posting or whatever it may be Instagram, Instacart, whatever it may be, say, how do you respond to these objections?
Mm,
You know, this
I
guy
like
Dave
that.
peddling him around. What do you think? Is he peddling around a bill of goods? By the way, it should
Yeah.
go without saying, I'm not making up any of these issues. I'm compiling what I believe are the best of some serious thinkers about this subject that don't
Mm,
rear their heads in popularizing mythology.
mm,
So write to them, write to your congressman, ask them to be accountable in these areas. Even if, look, if they may have some legitimate responses to some of this, maybe all
yeah.
of it, but it shortchanges the reader and the audience and shortchanges the
Mm,
question and diminishes it not to bring up these issues and not deal with these issues. If they have answers, great, give us the answer.
yeah.
If some of these questions are misguided, if the fundamental laws of physics aren't dynamical, if they do concern causation, which they don't, then correct us. Where do we go
Yeah.
wrong? You know,
Yeah.
um,
And that's where it's just continuing that conversation. Be like, here are the questions we have. Let's get them answered if they can be answered.
and to the extent we can, confront Sapolsky and Harris with them
True. Yeah, true.
collectively, and
They can't ignore all of us.
Harris is cornered to say, hey, come on, honestly, you
Yeah.
know, person to person. Let's go into the neuroscience and let's talk about the
Mm,
context studies. Let's talk about the measurement issues.
mm,
Let's talk about the correlations. What made you think, maybe you have a good reason for this, but what made you think that these kind of correlations in the 60 to 80% have anything to do with causation?
yeah. Yeah.
Demonstrate causation, they demonstrate the opposite. Why? What was your thinking? And maybe from a neuroscience perspective, he'll come up with something that where you go, oh, okay, yeah, at that time I could see why you were going in that
Mm,
direction. The study didn't come out, or that study didn't come out.
mm,
So I think in answer to your question, we have to get that dialogue going somehow.
yeah.
Uh, and if the audience or listeners believe, as I do, that there's more than meets the determinist eye, then the internet is a great forum to air questions and call upon people.
Absolutely. And I think if I've determined anything, it's that we need a David Lawrence versus Robert Sapolsky or Sam Harris debate.
Or anyone who's willing to look determinist doctrine in the eye and say, okay, let's not skip over the problems. Let's go through them.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you have an answer, we'd like to hear it. Because these things
Mm,
can't be squared with various aspects of science, and they can't be squared with various conceptual and philosophical problems.
yeah.
All right, you think you can justify determinism? Great. What is your response to these?
Yeah. What's the justification? Let's
Huh?
hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
That's great.
smart, you're educated. We value your input and your thoughts.
Yeah.
Seriously, you know, what do you have to say about this? How do you
Yeah.
derive how do you derive causal structures from a universe's fundamental physical laws don't include them?
Mm,
You know? So I think that's the direction, is to put these guys on the causal spot, and be open to the possibility that they have some pretty good answers, which they very well may have. They're smart,
it's true.
educated people.
Yeah.
Uh, as far as I see it, everybody has blind spots. I think they have a blind spot on this one. I have friends who are the most smart, rational, educated people who have nutty beliefs about one thing or another. I'm sure I do.
Hmm.
We
Yeah.
all have our blind spots, you might say. You
It's
know.
so true. Yeah. And some people become very successful off of them.
Well, many a publisher's advance has been earned based on blind spots, one might
It's true.
say. So God bless. They feed the family, they pay the mortgage.
Good for
But
them.
in the search for truth, I think we have to set the bar higher.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Sounds awfully presumptuous and pedantic and lofty, but I think we have to set the bar a bit higher.
Yeah, absolutely. We need something to strive for. And I think the higher we set it, higher potential we have of finding something.
Hopefully so. Amen.
Well, Debunking Determinism, Robert Sapolsky, Sam Harris, in the Crusade Against Free Will. Where can people find your book?
At a bookstore near you. Oh, excuse me. Relic of a bygone age myself. On Amazon, on the internet, the bookstore of the cosmos. Um,
Which, if you're
I-
waiting, if you're willing to wait a couple days, it's near you.
that's right.
Yeah,
Only a couple days away,
not bad.
depending on whether you're a member of Amazon Prime.
True. Get that
If you,
same day delivery.
yeah, and don't try and become a member. You're either caused to become one or you're not. So I mean,
You don't have a
let it,
choice.
let it flow. You don't have a choice. You don't even have a choice to think about letting it flow.
It's true. Some people
So
have it, some people
it's on
don't.
Amazon. Some people have it. That's right. Some people are caused to have it.
That's right.
Some
That's
people
right.
are caused not to. Also have a website called biochemicalrobots.com. That's a reference to a phrase in Harris's book that
That's awesome.
uses the metaphor that we are biochemical robots.
Mm,
We're not free. We don't have choice. We are biochemical robots.
dang.
And so
Cool
my
band name.
site is called biochemicalrobots.com. Let me hear from you. Write to me.
You have to say
Get
hi.
it off your chest, get it off your mind. I'll write to my congressman if you write to yours.
I love
Uh,
it.
biochemicalrobots.com. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I do.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation. Um and I think the fact that even through all of it, we were so willing to have this conversation still shows how important this topic is to you. And it's very important to me just to be able to hear these conversations and these ideas. And I think it's important to present those. So thank you again for coming on and talking about that.
Mhm.
And the links for everything will be in the description for you guys to take a look at. So go and enjoy those. They're for us. They're for everybody. For the people.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll talk to you guys hopefully sooner rather than later.